Good afternoon. The Seminar Committee, Department of History, University of Delhi welcomes you to a webinar with Dr. Madhumita Sengupta. Dr. Madhumita Sengupta is a historian who takes interest in social and cultural histories of colonial Assam and Bengal. She is assistant professor in humanities and social sciences in the Indian Institute of Technology, Gandhinagar, Gujarat. Her published works have appeared in journals like the Economic and Political Weekly, Indian Historical Review, Contributions to Indian Sociology, and Post-Colonial Studies. She did her MA from Center for Historical Studies, JNU, and her PhD from University of Calcutta. She was also a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta. She has been working at IIT Gandhinagar since 2014. Today, she will be speaking on commercialization of Bengali food, a case study of Bengali middle class amnesia. Before proceeding to the lecture, we would request you all to kindly keep your microphones muted while the speaker is presenting. And also you can keep your videos on if you like. Questions will be taken after the talk. The talk will be chaired by Professor Charu Gupta. She's here. And after the speaker has presented, she will be conducting the discussion with questions and comments of her own. And then from the audience, which includes audience from Facebook as well. So thank you. And let's begin. Ma'am, over to you. Madhumita, ma'am.
Okay, so should I
start? Yes, ma'am, you can start.
Thank you very much.
Can I just put in a word and welcome Dr. Madhumita Sengupta and say we're really looking forward to your talk. And I mean, food studies have flourished, in the past decade particularly. And so this talk is really, really exciting. So over to you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to meet you once again. We met briefly at Jadavpur University.
Yes, I do remember.
Organized, but that was years back. Yeah. Glad to meet you all. So let me begin by sharing my screen and then there you are. So hello everybody, and thank you for inviting me and thank you for joining me for this talk. I thank the Department of History, Delhi University, and especially Professor Akil for this kind invitation. In fact, Razi deserves a special thanks for his valuable comments and suggestions on an earlier draft of the paper that I'm going to talk about today. This is the first time I'm working with Bengal materials, and I would appreciate all your comments and suggestions. The title for today's talk is The Commercialization of Bengali Food, a case study of Bengali middle class amnesia. I would like to add that this paper, which has been accepted for publication, grew out of the master's dissertation of a student of mine at IIT Gandhinagar. Shreya Sen, the student and also my co-author in the paper, had examined the history of spice hotels in Bengal under my supervision. She had also examined some issues of the Bangla periodical Mashik Boshumoti to see whether there was any reference to spice hotels in this periodical. That was when it struck me that although so much was being written about food, no mention was being made about Bengali entrepreneurial ventures in food. And subsequently, I expanded the search to include other periodicals like the Grihasto Mongol, Bama Bodhini Potrika, and even Bongo Shri, as well as novels, short stories, and autobiographical literature. In its final form, the paper became a commentary on class, caste, and commensality in Bengal. The paper considers the early 20th century till the 1940s, that's the period. Shreya Sen, she's supposed to attend this talk. I've shared the link with her. She's currently Associate Consultant at Ernst & Young Global Consulting Services. Well, it is common knowledge that the historical archive is not very reliable and that it can distort. However, what if it confronts us with a deafening silence? What happens when we are offered no information whatsoever about something that we expect to be mentioned by our interlocutors. Today, I would like to narrate a situation where both the silence of the literary sphere and occasional statements by Bengali Bhadralok authors combined to create a very misleading picture of the marketing of Bengali food. So today's talk is about the commercialization of Bengali food and how class and caste-based commensal inhibitions were responsible for generating a certain kind of denial of the fact that cooked food had reached the market way back in the early 20th century. While stating our findings in this project, I shall also narrate the steps through which I was led to take the position that I do. The mystery that lent substance to the search for a market for Bengali food began with a chance reading of an essay called Bhojan Shilpi Bengali, written by the author, academician, and literary critic Buddhadev Bosu. Buddhadev Bosu observed remorsefully that the biggest shortcoming of Bengali cuisine was that it continues to remain obscure from the public domain. Bosu lamented that the city of Calcutta was devoid of any public eatery serving a quintessential Bengali meal, that typically comprised of rice, accompanied by red lentil soup, and deep-fried river fish cooked in the form of a curry with the addition of sweetened curd and jaggery. This particular work, Bhojan Shilpi Bengali, was published in 1971. Bosu's views were echoed by Shoaib Mujtaba Ali in an essay written sometime in 1974 called Bengali Menu, where the author remarked that a Bengali restaurant serving the quotidian home food of the Bengalis was missing in the city of Calcutta. Curiously, food cooked in the Bengali style had already come to the city markets by the 1930s. Beginning in the 1920s, a chain of public eateries called Pice Hotels or Rice Hotels, as they came to be called later, had mushroomed in suburban Bengal, offering home-style Bengali food to its clientele. How do we then explain the persistence of the idea till as late as the 1970s that Bengali food had failed to commercialize? The history of public dining in Bengal has so far not been documented well. Available information traces their systematic presence to the coming of the British in Bengal, and especially to the latter part of the 19th century. In recent years, many studies have been devoted to the emergence of eateries and the culture of dining out in pre-colonial and colonial South Asia. Scholars like Frank Conlon, Benjamin Siegel, Ashish Nandi, Madsen and Gardella are some of those who have examined the historical context to public eating in cities such as Bombay, Delhi, and elsewhere. Frank Conlon, for instance, has argued that an overwhelming anxiety about caste pollution was the principal stumbling block to the emergence of public eating in pre-modern South Asia. It was with the building of sarais, or resting places for travelers, that eating food cooked outside the home emerged as an expedient measure to accommodate the needs of soldiers and travelers. However, it was more the norm to travel in the company of servants who would procure the raw ingredients from a passing village to cook for the masters. Factors such as migration, enhanced opportunities for socializing, and increased mobility characterizing the colonial period precipitated the emergence of hotels and restaurants in colonial cities such as Bombay, Delhi, and Calcutta. Thus, the colonial encounter is supposed to have brought in its trend a new form of public modernity, which one author has referred to as quote-unquote eating modernity. Yet, the root and nature of this public modernity was not uniform across the subcontinent. Appadurai and Carol Breckenridge sound a caveat in their work on the emergence of a modernistic public culture in the subcontinent. They argue that the arrival of public modernity to places and peoples did not follow a uniform trajectory. We agree with Appadurai and Breckenridge and argue, in addition, that when recounting the story of eating modernity in colonial South Asia, it will not work to harp on modernity's unmitigated triumph. Instead, one cannot fail to notice how the progress of modernity was occasionally arrested, mutilated, and muted by constricting and conflicting practices that were decidedly pre-modern in their tone and tenor. We argue that the culture of eating out in colonial Calcutta was quote-unquote modern. Nevertheless, that its modernistic potential was arrested by the persistence of mitigating ties such as those of caste and class. This happened notwithstanding the sweeping rhetoric of emancipatory nationalism pervading the contemporary political environment and carrying within it the promise of release from age-old societal taboos. Now, while searching for Bengali food's commercial roots, we found that spice hotels first developed in the suburban areas of Bengal sometime in the mid-1920s. Strategically located near railway junctions and steamerways, they catered to travelers availing of cheaper modes of transportation. Spice hotels also came to be established in Calcutta, the colonial metropolis. By the 1940s, these had become popular enough for celebrated author Vibhuti Bhushan Bandyopadhyay to write a novel based on their experience. Vibhuti Bhushan's Adorsho Hindu Hotel provided rare insights into the social context behind the rapid proliferation of these cheap eateries, their low-key budgetary requirements, the social composition of their humble patrons, and such other pertinent details. These hotels were popular enough for Rabindranath Tagore to mention them briefly in his 1924 novel, Noka Dubi, where the hero, before boarding the Gwalanda steamer services, is supposed to have gone off to one of the numerous hotels dotting the ferry ghat or the river basin to grab a meal. There was scarcely mention of spice hotels or rice hotels in other contemporary novels. None of these works, however, ascribed much importance to these institutions in the way that Vibhuti Bhushan had done. What belied the rebuttals of Boshu and Shoaib Mujtaba Ali was the fact that spice hotels were serving quintessentially Bengali food consisting of rice, dal, and vegetables, at substantially reduced rates. Spice hotels were so called for the simple reason that any and every service offered here had a particular value attached to it. Many of these spice hotels survive till date. You can see the Hotel Torun Niketan, and I have copied out the text from the website. The list includes the Adorsho Hindu Hotel, the Young Bengal Hotel, the Hotel Torun Niketan, and the Hotel Siddheshwari Ashram and the Jagannatha Bhojanalaya, all of which are to be found in Calcutta. The food is still served on banana leaves or plates made of shal leaves to the accompaniment of lemon wedges, green chili, onions, and a blob of salt on the side. Earthen cups or bhars are used for serving water. No conscious efforts have been made to enhance the aesthetic appeal of the food served or even of the ambience, perhaps because the clientele appears to be more interested in the food rather than in the ambience. Occupying tables on a sharing basis is the common protocol as against exclusive tables unless people visit in groups. This makes these eateries a great social leveler, unlike most other public eateries. It is clear, even from whatever scanty references we could find, that spice hotels or rice hotels, as they came to be called, were popular with a section of the population, presumably comprising of the lower class, middle class Bengali Babu, the student or the small-time itinerant trader or business man having to travel frequently for occupational purposes. The central protagonist in Bandyopadhyay's Adorsho Hindu Hotel started his venture with the help of an informal credit network. With the help of an informal credit network, that is, with money borrowed from chance acquaintances. This novel, written and published in 1940, was a tribute to the efflorescence of a food culture of a very different kind, one that was plebeian and rooted in the Bengali ways of eating. Our digital survey of the founding members of these spice hotels indicated that unlike the proprietors of the fancier restaurants of the colonial metropolis, those who invested in these ventures did not hail from affluent upper class or even upper caste backgrounds. The shabbiness of their spatial setup indicates that these ventures must have been built on a paltry budget. It is easy to surmise that Bandyopadhyay would have modeled the Adarsha Hindu Hotel on the actual functioning of a Pice Hotel. Apart from creating alternate avenues of employment for a host of people employed as cooks, serving hands, and helpers, these institutions also signaled the resurgence of Bengali entrepreneurship. A quick digital survey of the websites of some of these Pice hotels still in existence in Kolkata revealed that many of these had been established between 1915 and 1940. The Hotel Torun Niketan, located on Rashbihari Avenue near the Kalighat metro station in Kolkata, was established in 1915 by Ishan Dev, who hailed from East Bengal, present-day Bangladesh. The establishment of this hotel coincided with the launching of the Swadeshi movement in India and aimed at catering to the population that was migrating from the suburbs and villages, where food was scarce, to the urban cityscape of Calcutta. It also intended to serve the professional class of office-going city dwellers and has remained a family-run business to this day. Running at a stretch from 10 a.m. in the morning to 10:30 p.m. at night, the hotel still serves a basic vegetarian meal at ₹40. Non-vegetarian food available here includes meat and a wide variety of fish. The Hotel Shitholi Ashram, located on Mirza Ghalib Street in Jan Bazar, Kolkata, was established in 1938 by Khudiram Sarkar, a resident of the Bardhaman district of Bengal. It initially began as a mess bari, which was shut down soon after, but the hotel survived and has remained a family business since then. The Young Bengal Hotel, located in Fancy Market at Kidarpur, Kolkata, was established in 1925 by Tarapada Guhore from Borishal, East Bengal, to provide elaborate meals, primarily rice, to the people of West Bengal at very subsidized rates. A section of the lower middle class Bengali population clearly found in Pice hotels an easy and affordable avenue for investment and employment. The recipes being quintessentially drawn from what was cooked in the average Bengali household allowed the mobile office goers functioning on a shoestring budget to eat home-like food while on the move. The Pice hotels had truly ushered in a social and gastronomical revolution that should not have gone unnoticed. Now, our search for the missing Pice hotel led us initially to the Bengali periodical Mashik Boshumati, which contained no mention of these institutions or anything connected to Bengali enterprises in food. I next decided to examine issues of the Grihostha Mongol and the Bamagodhini Potrika, two other Bengali periodicals. I even checked some issues of the Bongoshri that was published from 1944 onwards. I found nothing on the Pice hotels. Interestingly, both the Mashik Boshumati and the Grihostha Mongol had features on food in most of their issues. Literary periodicals by then were publishing a wide range of materials, novels, short stories, short reports, travel articles, reminiscences, and informative pieces on a wide array of subjects as well as on interesting subjects. I was convinced that I should find something there. However, try as I might, I could not find anything on Pice hotels. I next expanded my search to include novels and short stories written in the early to the mid-20th centuries. When I tried to see which other authors had mentioned Pice hotels, which, by the way, had become quite ubiquitous in suburban areas by the 1920s, I found that there was almost nothing. I had read authors like Utshare and Jayanto Sengupta on food functioning as a vehicle for articulating a nationalist response. Utshare has argued that the discourse of taste articulated through the material culture of food helped in the self-fashioning of the Bhadralok class in Bengal. This discourse produced a quote-unquote modern and a quote-unquote cosmopolitan Bengali cuisine in which taste and aesthetics emerged as the key markers of the standards of good and bad. Utshare's arguments were based, among others, on a survey of Bengali literary periodicals, and I was keen to look at these periodicals myself. And I chose to look at a later period, that is between 1920 to 40, in the hope that by that time Pice hotels would have been far too ubiquitous to overlook. To my astonishment, however, I found food-related writings in the period between 1925 to 42 of a very different kind. These were writings of very different kind. Meanwhile, I had also looked at novels and autobiographical literature. and found that although this contained numerous references to the burgeoning cabin culture in Bengal, especially in Calcutta, they gave only cursory attention to the Pice hotels. I wondered whether this blissful amnesia came from an upper-class obsession with fine dining experiences that made writers impervious to a humbler culinary acumen. However, this seemed far from the truth, especially in the light of the kind of food-related writings that we found in periodicals from the 1930s onwards. So far as the periodicals were concerned, by the late 1930s and the 40s, these had more or less ceased to talk about food recipes or food aesthetics. The previous era's enthusiasm for culinary experiments and aestheticization mentioned by scholars had been replaced with a somber appreciation of the more material dimensions of food, including its nutritive qualities and biological functions as the source and sustainer of life. So periodicals such as the Mashik Boshumati, Brihasto Mongol, Bamabuthini Potrika, and Bongoshri that had once romanticized culinary experiences continued to speak about food, but no longer from the perspective of aesthetics or refinement as a nationalistically constituted cultural rhetoric. The periodicals were still talking about food, but from a more pragmatic perspective of food sufficiency and nutrition. Food-related writings from the period spoke about the need to develop agro-industries to meet the employment concerns of the youth. They urged the people to eat well and eat healthy rather than fashionable food, which was ultimately useless for the body. There were regular features on how agro-industries could potentially transform the dismal employment scenario of the country. This is what I found in these periodicals. The social context for this shift was provided by the emergence of a more truculent nationalism, accompanied by a realistic assessment of the need to maintain the supply chain in order to avoid food deficit. The specter of food shortage and famine seemed to haunt all kinds of food-related writings in contemporary Bengali language periodicals from the middle of the 1920s. Essays in the Grihosto Mongol, one of the most prolific periodicals that had previously published dietary manuals, now focused on the remedial action needed to resolve the looming threat of food scarcity called Onno Samosya. They prescribed methods to increase agricultural productivity and iterated the absolute importance of eating healthy food substances. The drawing of close analogy between a healthy body and a healthy economy was the outcome of a political culture that was increasingly restive about issues of unemployment and economic underdevelopment in the late colonial period. In 1943, Bengal would be confronted with the worst famine in its history. The growing communal unrest, coupled with the poor employment scenario, had contributed already to a politically volatile environment, with both nationalist and communist parties vying for political mileage. The pragmatic style of writing food was ushered in by the prevailing poll that fueled a sense of alarm about the likelihood of an imminent food scarcity arising from the lack of state intervention and the corresponding downturn in agricultural productivity in Bengal, already hampered by the parceling out of land among multiple shareholders and tenants. With the onset of a new genre of food writing, the nationalist rhetoric in Bengal seemed to have entered into its final and more mature and futuristic phase, characterized by a call for self-help and self-sufficiency in the agrarian economy through advocacy of concrete measures for developing village-centric industries and sustaining scientific interventions to enhance agricultural productivity. The Mashik Boshumati, a prominent Bengali language literary periodical that was published from 1922 onwards and finds recurrent mention in secondary literature on food, seems to have gone out of the way to employ a rural correspondent whose job it was to report on rural agriculture. In short, the mood characterizing representations of food in the post-1920s was quite grim and petulant rather than effusive and romantic. And I felt that the new realism in writing food ought to have provided the perfect backdrop for acknowledging the novelty and enterprising spirit behind the marketing of Bengali food. It seemed to me to be both curious and ironic that, notwithstanding the repeated emphasis on the need to preserve and sustain bodily vitality through a return to basic food habits, there was virtually no mention anywhere of how the Pice hotels, apart from generating employment and creating investment opportunities, were also striving to bring affordable and healthy food to a large section of the population. It is quite ironic that these hotels had escaped the notice of a literati busy discussing the economic slump and the lack of initiative displayed by the Bengali youth, as well as the erosion of healthy dietary habits. There were occasional lamentations by none other than Acharya Prafulla Chandra Ray, the celebrated chemistry professor, Swadeshi entrepreneur, and founder of Bengal Chemicals, on how the Bengali youth were shying away from the entrepreneurial ventures, leaving the field free for Marwaris and other migrant communities. In a lengthy section in his autobiography titled Attuchorit, or the life and experiences of a Bengali chemist, Acharya Prafulla Chandra Ray further stated that Bengal's economy was dominated by migrants like the Marwaris and the Biharis simply because there was little or no initiative from the local Bengali youth to develop the region's abundant agricultural and other resources. It was surprising that Ray should overlook the fact that an initiative had indeed been undertaken in a small yet significant manner to overcome the entrepreneurial void of yesteryears. So the manner of writing food in the print periodicals of the 1920s and the 30s was indisputably predicated on an expansion of the social base of the middle class in Bengal and mirrored the widening of the latter's social and cultural outlook. The call for reviving agriculture, the questioning of the replacement of manual labor by intellectual labor, and the strong criticisms of the government pointed towards the emergence of newer class aspirations and a more representational political culture. This surmise is borne out by the fact that there was clearly a sustained readership for these articles and reports, which continued to appear with greater frequency. The new trends were replicated in the political sphere by the proliferation of radical outfits and trade unions from the 1930s onwards. Yet, my question was, why did the pioneering role of the Pice hotels not receive any attention? One plausible explanation could be that the social elite, which in the case of colonial Bengal was also the literary elite, was unwilling to relinquish its leadership role in the social sphere and were reluctant to accord greater visibility to an initiative coming from the emergent social groups whose presence both in the organized and the unorganized sectors was steadily on the rise. Hence, they were loath to give credence to the new entrepreneurial spirit animating the activities of the lower classes and the lower caste groups. I was in a dilemma. To what could we ascribe this collective silence on the role played by the Pice hotels? Was it a class or a caste-coded omission? Clearly, it was an omission. Of that, there could be no doubt. It was to find an answer to this that I decided to turn to novels and literature in general. Meanwhile, I came across interesting findings in Doipa and Shen's recent study of Dalit politics in the 1930s and 40s. Shen's study revealed efforts made by the upper caste Bhadralok to dismiss the growing demands for addressing the issue of caste in Bengal's electoral politics. Shen demonstrated that the marginal presence of caste in Bengal's electoral politics was due to the pressure created by an upper caste leadership who maneuvered to make the Dalit leaders withdraw their demands. Again, in his study of caste politics in Bengal, Shekhar Bandyopadhyay showed that many lower caste groups became prominent in Bengal's politics from the 20th century onwards, a period that witnessed a surge in caste associations and caste politics. Bandyopadhyay's work showed that there was a great deal of discontent among the upper castes regarding British attempts to grant more visibility and political power to the backward caste. That print in Bengal in particular was dominated by the upper caste is difficult to ignore. One look at the surnames of authors writing in the literary periodicals that I talk about will suffice to illustrate this point. Sumit Sarkar has argued that print widened opportunities for hitherto marginal groups such as women and authors of relatively plebeian origin. While this may have been true in principle, the impact of the change was more visible in the domain of popular print rather than in the realm of high print, where the upper castes continued to dominate. Everything in the case of Pice hotels seemed to point towards a caste-coded behavior. In this case, however, the omission of any reference to the emergent food ventures appeared to me to be far more deeply rooted than a deliberate oversight of a lower caste venture. Given the realism evinced in food-related writings in periodical literature, it seemed unlikely that Bengali food's commercial foray would have been ignored simply on account of the class sensibilities of the Bhadralok. What strengthened my belief was the fact that literary works depicting Bhadralok society during the 20s and the 30s are replete with evidences of a barely suppressed anxiety over eating in a mixed caste company at a time when the requirements of collectivized politics was encouraging a rare degree of openness in political and associational life among members of this class. Transgressions of such norms were undertaken and even ignored under dire circumstances, such as traveling long distances, etc., when the non-availability of food compelled one to eat in the company of all kinds of people or partake of food cooked by people from the lower caste. This was not, however, a measure that was undertaken under ordinary circumstances. In this connection, I would like to mention that while the culinary preferences of the Bhadralok has become the source of numerous studies dealing with the former's class character, sufficient attention has not been paid to the former's caste attributes. The caste character of Bengali food has so far escaped the attention of scholars interested in studying the discursive life of food in Bengal. The study of caste in Bhadralok diet and dietary practices is complicated by the fact that the latter did not seem to harbor any ill feelings towards the cabins or more Western style hotels and restaurants where the cooks could be of Muslim or Christian origin and where both eating arrangements and the clientele were of a mixed and heterogeneous kind. The issue of caste in food is further obfuscated by the fact that all sections of the people consumed non-vegetarian food. Seemed to consume non-vegetarian food. However, in his compendium on Bengali culture of 1,000 years, Ghulam Murshid cites evidence drawn from older poetical tracts such as the Mongol Kabbos to argue that Bengalis had a tradition of consuming fish rather than meat. It was only through contact with the Nawabi rule that the consumption of meat became popular among a few highly affluent Hindu families that had direct links with the Nawabs. Murshid correctly points out that both onion and garlic, identified by Bengalis with non-vegetarian food, entered into ordinary Hindu cuisine at a much later date. There was a strong resistance to these vegetables for a fairly long time. The Shaktos occasionally consumed sacrificial goat, deer, or tortoise meat, but this would be cooked without onion and garlic. Chicken was popular only with the Muslims, while various kinds of wild animals, including pigs and porcupines, were consumed regularly by members lower down in the caste hierarchy. In an essay titled Randhan Jogyo, Shoyed Mujtaba Ali mentions that Bengalis were incapable of cooking meat items, although they did consume meat curries on their travel by the Kuala steamer services. All this indicates that there did exist a serious hiatus between the dietary practices of the upper and the lower caste. Nevertheless, both eggs and chicken did eventually make their way into the upper caste diet via the conscious adoption of Western food habits. Had eating taboos been followed seriously, the practice of eating out in these cabins or upper caste restaurants and hotels would not have emerged as one of the major gastronomic entertainment forms of gastronomic entertainment for the middle class Bengali from the early decades of the 20th century. A digital survey shows that many of the fashionable cabins of Kolkata, such as the Onadi cabin, the Fern Hotel and Restaurant, or the Mitro Cafe, were found in the 1920s and the 1930s. Now, what is important to note, however, is that notwithstanding the 20th century transition to a more quote-unquote cosmopolitan platter, commensality issues and caste biases continued to haunt the everyday eating habits of the colonial metropolis. Shekhar Bandyopadhyay states that separate messes were set up in the city to accommodate Namashudra students. This was owing to the reluctance of upper caste boarders to interdine with the low caste boarders. Although Bandyopadhyay's work is peppered with the disclaimer that caste was never a serious concern in Bengal and that untouchability never acquired the seriousness that it did in many other parts of the subcontinent, the very imperative of having to set up separate messes tells a different story. Many 20th century literary representations of caste in Bengali society testify to the observance of commensality restriction. Adarsho Hindu Hotel shows a conscious decision to employ a Brahmin cook and a clear demarcation of sitting arrangements against payment of extra money. In fact, many of these hotels employed Brahmin cooks, popularly called the Bamun Thakur, with an eye to attracting diverse clientele who may not all have hailed from the traditional higher castes, but considered themselves higher to other caste groups and accordingly refused to eat alongside the latter. The mess baris of Calcutta in the early decades of the 20th century employed Brahmin, Bengali, and Uriya cooks. Works like Sharat Chandra Chattopadhyay's Charitrahin depict the reliable figure of the Brahmin cook or Thakur Moshai, catering to the gastronomical requirements of a host of young men living together in the numerous basha baris that provided shelter to the office-going Bengali Babu or the students studying for their college degree in Calcutta. Set in the early 20th century, 1917, that is, Charitrahin depicts the lives of the upper caste residents and their careful adherence to caste-coded rituals despite living in an alien environment away from home. Rabindranath Thakur's 1924 novel Nauka Dubi also demonstrates that there was a demand for Brahmin cooks in upper caste households. In his autobiography called Jiboner Smriti Dipe, the historian Ramesh Chandra Majumdar mentions an incident that took place in 1923 during the Saraswati Puja celebrations at the Dhaka University, where Majumdar was teaching at the time. A group of upper caste students demanded that the anjali or flower offerings to the goddess should be held separately for the upper and lower caste students. They also demanded that the distribution of bhog or food cooked as part of the puja rituals should be done in separate batches for the upper caste and the lower caste or the normal shudras. The upper caste students refused to sit alongside the lower caste while eating the bhog. When the vice chancellor failed to persuade the agitating students to give up their demands, R.C. Majumdar himself intervened to formally inform the students that the demands could not be met. Now, given the fact that partaking of delicacies in Western-style eateries was fairly common among this section of the middle class, how do we then explain the paradox of caste-coded behavior among the Bhadralok? Ucha Ray quotes Bipin Chandra Pal, the noted freedom fighter, to argue that there were definitive taboos on the consumption of rice prepared by people of lower caste. Eating lentils and curries, however, did not incur the same kind of ritual pollution. The employment of Brahmin cooks by the Kolkata-based messes is corroborated by Bipin Chandra Pal in his autobiography. Pal, however, mentions that some students strictly adhered to restrictions associated with the consumption of rice cooked by a member of the lower caste groups. He also mentions that although students living in these messes of Calcutta adhered to caste rules inside the precincts of the messes, once outside, many of them consumed forbidden food prepared by Muslim bawarchis in big hotels such as the Great Eastern Hotel. Sharat Chandra Chattopadhyay's celebrated novel Srikanto, set in the early 20th century, describes how the Bengali Bhadralok taboos on commensality were consciously shrugged off while traveling in steamers where food was cooked by the steamer hands, popularly known as the khalashis. Most of these khalashis were Muslims and their culinary skills were legendary. Sharat Chandra's eponymous hero Srikanto is also surprised to see how carelessly these commensality restrictions stemming from caste boundaries could be abandoned for the sake of surviving in an alien environment. These observations may be found in the section Srikanto Abhaya, where the hero was forced to leave and eat at a hotel called Dathapure Hotel. When asked, the people told the hero that these restrictions remained, but that they were in temporary abeyance during the foreign sojourn and that some sort of penance would suffice to restore the people to their original faith. The description indicates that the transgression of commensality ties was considered as an expedient measure not to be pursued indefinitely or under ordinary circumstances. Such transgressions were certainly not meant to be celebrated, and that consuming forbidden food was followed by a brief penance or prashchitta to cleanse the body and the soul for what was perceived as a temporary lapse. References to this may also be found in Sharat Chandra's Pathed Dabi. A Manoranjan Vyapari's autobiography interrogating my Chandal life, describing the politics and the social scenario in the 70s, indicates a continued preference for Brahmin cooks. When he himself was driven to take up a cooking job, he had to conceal his caste identity and fake a Kayastho identity. Now, one has to read some of these novels produced during this period to know that not only did this depict the social reality of commensal tables in Bengali society, they also in a way reproduce this very prejudice. The best illustration of the latter comes from the fact that there is just the fact that these rice hotels occupied a very marginal presence within the overall structure of the novelistic plot. Vibhuti Bhushan's Adarsh Hindu Hotel was the only notable exception to this trend insofar as it placed these institutions at the center of the narrative. The Pice hotels were clearly not the preferred social spaces for dining out for the upper caste and upper class Bhadralok. Even when sections of the group felt it expedient to resort to these eateries for want of a better substitute, it was something that they were not ready to boast about. Eating at the Pice hotels did not conform to the Bhadralok's image of a socially desirable culinary experience. There was a constant fear of pollution from sharing a seat with a low-caste client or from the use of the common salt bowl, perhaps kept on the table and held by numerous hands of unknown origin. Likewise, the serving boys were bound to be hired from very diverse backgrounds. The cooks, one assumed, would be Brahmins, but one could never be completely sure, given that the owners themselves hailed from the lower strata of the society. Popular stories abound in Bengal that villagers from other provinces traveling to Kolkata to try their fortunes in the city would take a dip in the Ganges and slip on the sacred thread available for purchase on the banks of the river. Circulation of such stories and rumors signify a deep-seated social anxiety about caste mobility and pollution induced by touch. There is no reason to assume that the upper caste authors of periodicals and novelistic literature were insulated from this social tension. By comparison, the Anglo-Indian hotels of the urban metropolis were considerably cleaner, more sophisticated, and although they too did not hire their employees on the basis of caste or creed, the food served therein exuded an elitist aura and charm, stemming from their association with the British ruling class or the Nawabi ruling class of pre-colonial Bengal. In a way, food consumed in these elite spaces was culturally and socially empowering. Known as khanshamas and bawarchis, chefs in these eateries were trained to serve aesthetically pleasing and cosmopolitan fare in style to their discerning clientele. While Pice hotels would have failed on both grounds of class and caste, these Anglo-Indian eateries would have cleared the test of class, if not of caste, as eating here would have made for an aesthetically fine dining experience, catering to the social ambitions of the aspirational middle class subject. The caste angle was not altogether ignored, since the dispersed spatial arrangement within these upscale eateries ordinarily ruled out possibilities of direct contact with undesirable co-diners. So we're going to come to the end of my talk. There's just one, a few things that I just have to add before I conclude. The point that I'm trying to make is this. Let me reiterate. The failure of early 20th century novelistic, autobiographical, and periodical literature to acknowledge or celebrate the novelty and social significance of the commercialization of Bengali food reflected the deep-rooted caste and class prejudices underlying the dietary and literary choices of the Bengali Bhadralok class. The failure of Bengali writers to acknowledge the pioneering role of Pice hotels in offering a socially inclusive dining experience in Bengal contrasted with the effusive celebration of the new culinary experiments that created a cosmopolitan eating culture of public dining in the colonial city of Calcutta at the turn of the early 19th century Bengal. At the turn of the 20th century. Our study foregrounds how the introduction of colonial modernity in early 19th century Bengal heralded the practice of eating out that helped melt certain social boundaries and entailed complex social negotiations and transgressions, but also at the same time reinforced a bid to sustain some of the older restrictions, albeit in innovative ways. This study also underscores the need to widen the conventional historical archive in order to track social practices, relations, and attitudes that do not ordinarily find mention in official records. We use literature as an archive to overcome the limitations of archival data pertaining to the social. We subscribe to the view that the multiplicity of example or reputation of images, objects, and trends across literary works and the focus of significance within a text are patterns that can help establish a correspondence between literary realities and social realities. I argue that in understanding the social, it would not serve the purpose to ascertain direct causal relations. One has to rely on broad surmises and correlations rather than striving for deterministic explanations and direct causal connections. How does a researcher interpret the lack of mention of an important social phenomenon in an otherwise representative sphere, such as the domain of print periodicals? At a time when food and nutrition were drawing serious literary attention from among the province's cognoscenti, eager to write about nearly all aspects of social and cultural activities, it seems only reasonable to expect that the rise of new eating spaces serving cooked food to harried travelers should attract literary attention across all genres, be that the novelistic or the periodical. Not only did this not happen, there was also denial in addition to make matters worse. Thank you very much. That's all. And once again, thank you for being there and bearing with me. And I'd love to hear your comments and suggestions.
Thanks so much, Madhumita. That was such an enjoyable and such a rich paper. And I love the way in which you were able to, intersect, questions of urbanization, commercialization, literature, food practices, modernity, caste and class, and, really present a much more layered and complex picture. And so really congratulations to writing such a wonderful paper, and I really hope that it becomes part of a larger work. And of course, as you were presenting, I was just contemplating, while literature, like while you say, in the end as well, that, because the conventional archive doesn't seem to give you the answers, you had to go to literature. But in this case, literature, including periodicals and Bhadralok literature, seems to suffer the same kind of problems. In fact, I would argue even more of a problem than the official archive, where they are not recognizing the kind of wider basis of the commercialization of Bengali food and of the Pice hotels. So I was wondering, if perhaps if we go back to the official archives, and here I was particularly thinking of working class histories and the official archive, where so there is so much on migration. I mean, men are migrating often much more than women to these urban centers, and the question of where they are getting their food. I mean, there is so much written about how in working class areas, the distinctions that were being made about kacha and pakka food, and what kind of food, so kind of labor politics and left politics was also intertwining with caste politics and questions of food. And I was just wondering if this kind of archive can open some of these arenas of looking at how food is being consumed on the streets of the cosmopolitan arenas. So my first question is about this kind of intersection between labor histories and working class histories, and and caste, and the kind of commercialization of food, or the kind of public spaces of food consumption. So, can you throw some light on that? Have you tried to see those kind of working class histories? And let me just put 5, 6, and you can answer. My second question is that this seems to be a very male arena, eating out. And I was just wondering, I mean, I can't help it since I'm a gender historian. So the gendered composition of those eating out, it seems that the very act of commercialization of food, on the one hand, of course, challenges the idea which, Utsa Reyes, for example, says in a book of, cooking as a classical feminine act and as a feminine space, or the kitchen as a sacred space. Now, the very idea that the commercialization of food is largely male dominated, and even those who are eating out seem to be largely men. So I was just wondering, it completely punctures in many ways the argument that has been made about increasing feminization of food, and how commercialization throws up the moment food becomes commercial. There is a gendered dimension to it also, besides caste and class dimension. And now the third point that I wanted to make was that these now you seem to now I was just wondering, like, while you keep stressing in your papers that these spice hotels were ubiquitous, or that they were very popular, and they seem to be there substantially much more, what is your source for this, besides the images that you have shown us, and besides the but I mean, how do you know that they were so popular, or that they were that they were frequented by large numbers? I mean, what is the source for this? Like, because you are quoting journals which seem to be missing out on Pice hotels. You are quoting autobiographies which again seem to be missing out on the Pice hotels. But then you showed us these images in the beginning. But is there something which shows that they were increasingly popular? And how do you know that they were owned by the lower castes? I mean, that surprised me, that who are the owners of these spice hotels? The very fact that some of them are employing perhaps Brahmins as cooks, and are they all Bengalis, or are there, I mean, the way in which Marwari entrepreneurs were entering every field, are these spice hotels owners perhaps Marwaris as well? So I was just wondering about the ownership of these spice hotels, and whether really you can say that it is the lower classes and castes who are the owners of these hotels. I also had this one question that I mean, I don't know if this kind of distinction that we often make, that there is this elite class and they eat at elite places, or which have this grand ambience, and they have this kind of place where English tastes and Bengali cuisine intermix, and then there are these kind of lower eatery joints which are visited by the lower castes only. And there is so what you seem to suggest, or maybe that there is a clear distinction between not just the physicality and the spatiality and geographical location of elite hotels and say the Pice hotels, but also of the clientele, ownership. And also I was just wondering if this sharp distinction really works at the ground, because while there are these kind of caste questions, very big, very major caste questions, and there are very major kind of class questions, but I was just wondering if the questions of taste, of the question of you get yummy food at this particular place overcomes at times these caste and class hesitancies. So like if you compare it to today's time, you will see a very local chola bhatura shop would be visited by people from across castes, across classes. So I was just wondering if there are some examples to show that these distinctions were getting also blurred, by this kind of commercialization of food, the kind of caste and class distinction. It could also be a ground, on the one hand, of sharpening these distinctions, but on the other hand also as a leveler of these distinctions, or a blurring of these distinctions. The commercialization perhaps blurred these distinctions. So those are some of my comments and questions. Please feel free to take whatever you want to, but I must say it was a I really enjoyed the paper, and it was very layered.
Thank you so much. I'll try to answer, all your questions, perhaps not very satisfactorily, because this is a very limited project. And, to go back to your first question, I won't be able to remember the order, but I'm going to just respond to them. And if I have left something out, you could probably point that out to me. So the first question, the first comment that you had about this, how this could be part of a larger project where we look at labor history, where we look at eating habits and spaces, in the city, across the city, take into account the factors such as, migrations, etc. Where do these people eat? What do they eat? Who are the food suppliers? What kind of food they eat? That definitely is a much, much larger project, towards which this very limited work could, point towards. And, I'd be happy if I can, not sure whether I shall be able to do it, but I'd be happy to, to do that at some point. And I really appreciate that suggestion. And definitely I have not looked at all the eating spaces. That's the limitation of the project. But so far as the sources are concerned, I was looking at the websites of many of these. Some of these I have shown, 2 of these I showed there, but I could not have more slides. But while I was looking across the websites of many of these rice hotels, all of which still exist, I could see that I was noting down the names of the owners. I was looking at the fact that these spice hotels continue to be with the same family that had set them up initially. So clearly, this definitely indicates that they were successful enterprises, that they did not change hands. And clearly, I was also noting down, as I said, the names of the owners, which Ishan Deb, for instance, was one name that I cited in my talk. And it was evident that these were definitely not the upper castes of, Chattopadhyays, Bandopadhyays, and, even the Bengali Boidos, for instance. That much was clear from some of these names. Now, one thing that was evident when I was looking at the write-ups, the contents of the websites, they not only said that they were functioning since 1923 or 1915 or the 1938 or so on. They also mentioned the names of the authors. They also mentioned the names of the kind of food that they had been serving, the manner, the practices, etc. It was evident that not much change has taken place. The address remains the same. And there were quite a few, although for want of time and space, they could not all be mentioned. So they constitute my primary source. And that was how I began to look at, get interested in the history of spice hotels. Now, one thing that bothered me constantly, I must admit, was the fact that I could not find any mention of spice hotels anywhere, except in Adorsho Hindu Hotel. But as I mentioned in my talk, Adorsho Hindu Hotel clearly seemed to be modeled on the actual functioning of a spice hotel. It was a very realistic kind of portrayal, and the fact that it was functioning on a shoestring budget, the fact that there was an informal trade network, credit network that Hajari Brahmon, made use of while starting his own venture. These were factors that seemed to resonate with the contents of many of the websites that I read while working on this project. And there seemed to be very strong similarities there. And therefore, I drew the kind of conclusions that I made. So that is to explain the way I had functioned. And the other was the question of ubiquity and popularity and all of that. Many of these novels that I did refer to, whether Shrikanto or Pothed or Nokadubi or many others for that matter, which I could not mention, they fleetingly somehow mention the fact that, the protagonists, they grab a meal there before they board the Gwalando steamer service. They eat here and there. Shahid Mujtaba Ali talks about the food served on these steamer services. I was also looking at the Gwalando, the line, the steamer line and all that, and reading up on some railway history and steamer history there. There are mentions of the food that was served and how popular they were, so much so that the Gwalando mangsho, the bit curry, continues to be immensely popular even now. And that's a recipe that I could find on the website, and I also tried it out myself. So Gwalando chicken curry, that is, it continues to be known by its name, indicating how popular it really was. Now, all that definitely indicates that the food was consumed. It was not as if the blurring of caste distinctions that you talk about is also something that I mentioned. So this food was consumed sometimes quite readily, sometimes because no other choices were available. And that did bring temporarily at least these two sections of the population together. But this was not something that I could say had led to a total melting away of all kinds of social boundaries. That was clearly not happening, because otherwise, how could we really explain the fact that these were not finding mention in novels which were actually celebrating, for instance, a Farn Hotel or a Mitro Cafe or a Great Eastern Hotel, but not Jaganmata Bhojanalaya or Shitholi Ashram. So clearly something was wrong there, and we cannot really say that there was a complete blurring of the distinctions. That is one thing that I found. So that about the question of ubiquity, popularity, and all, the fact that they continue to do business, they have not disappeared, and the number of Pice hotels that we still find functioning in various places, they do certainly strengthen the point of ubiquity and popularity that I was referring to. About the question of the gendering of food here, commercial food and all that, Hajari Brahman, Adorsho Hindu Hotel talks about the woman assistant who was actually cheating in this case, but there's a strong presence of this female protagonist. She's one of the central figures in the novel, and she definitely plays a very important role in helping in gathering the material together so that Hajari Brahman can cook and all that. And in one of the websites of One Pice Hotel, at least, I found that the women of the family took an important, they played a leading role in running the hotel. I think it was Shitholi Ashram. I have to check my notes, but here and there you do find mention that they did also come into the family business in various capacities, maybe not as managers or not as but one other point that comes to my mind is that in Adorsho Hindu Hotel, when Hajari Brahman thinks about starting his own venture, he goes to a woman whom he used to know, and she's the one who lends money so that he could start his venture. So it's not as if the women are not there, and they are definitely mentioned here and there. Clearly that also depicts social reality as it was. So that's one thing that I did find. But clearly, in order to for this to become a larger commentary on eating spaces in general, food supply, the food supply chain, and the migrant workers and where they stayed and what they ate and all. This certainly requires more, further research in this area for this to become a larger commentary on caste coded behavior in the city. That definitely remains, one of the limitations of the project, I completely admit. But, and I really appreciate this suggestion, and this is something that I'm going to look at. But this is also work that I did during the pandemic, and my mobility was also, it's not to justify, but was restricted. And one of the things that I don't know where to find, but could be something that could open up new areas of research, is the records from some of these establishments. Mesbari records are not available. I don't know where to get them. I had thought about them some time back, but maybe I need to look around further. If we get some records, if we get some more autobiographies, more people living records of them. I read, for instance, Nobin Shen's autobiography in trying to understand where I could. So some of these people who had written autobiographies, I was looking at those to see if I could get any data on what kind of where they were eating, what kind of eating public dining spaces existed and all that. Unfortunately, I drew a blank with at least some of the one's text that I was searching at that point, but definitely there are prospects for enlarging this.
Thanks, Madhumita. As I said, again, a very rich paper. Now there are, it's also being watched on Facebook, and so there are many comments. So I'm going to just read all of them, and we'll take all the questions, and then I'll give in the end I'll give the floor back to you. And you can respond to whatever you feel like. So, for example, there is Abhijit Sarkar, who has asked, is there just one Bengali cooking style? Is it possible to think in terms of an area study approach to cuisine or eating or eatery studies? This might be a way around boundary constructions. Okay, then there is one comment by Indrashis Banerjee on Facebook, who says that Pies Hotel, as pronounced, still from price, perhaps. I don't know what that means, but I'm just reading those out. Then there is Moimita Day, who says, can you please highlight the changing gender dimension in the culinary culture of Bengal? How did the role of women and men change in this field? I think to some extent you answered that. Then there is Rashmi Zaikia, who says, when we talk about the Bengali cuisine, we always discuss about the food culture of West Bengal. But prior to independence, East Bengal also has a very distinct food culture, different from West Bengal, especially Dhakai cuisine, Sylheti style cooking, and many more. What is your view regarding East Bengal cuisine culture and why there is less talk and research in those areas? Then Suparna Bhattacharya says that young students migrating to Kolkata were not well off and they had to cook by themselves or with the help of elder brother, etc., as we see in the biography of Vidyasagar or Sharat Chandra writings. They were bringing their recipes and dishes, but must have also gradually adapted, tasted the cosmopolitan cooking and dishes. And we read the regional food obsessions brought along and the shift to new city food cooking style as the forging of a typical modern urban identity. Or Paromita Das Gupta says via Facebook, Calcutta was always a cosmopolitan city. I'm curious about the intermingling of customers in these low price, iconic Hindu hotels. How would they find out the caste of a Bihari or Marwari, or did they ever visit these hotels? So, so those are a few of the questions. And now I open the floor for participants here to ask their questions. You can raise your hand and ask yourselves, and then I'll give it in the end to Madhumita to respond to whatever she feels like. And I know there's too much on her plate already. So if anybody wants to say anything or comment or ask a question, please do. See somebody raising their hands, but I'm not sure if I
think while if they are thinking of asking questions while they get started, maybe I could just begin by
yes, please do.
Was always a cosmopolitan city. The last one, Soumya Malik. I am curious about the intermingling of customers in these low-price iconic Hindu hotels. Yes, of course, there was quite an intermingling. As I was talking about, we were talking about caste and the intermingling of clients coming from diverse social backgrounds, even Bengali Hindus coming from different caste backgrounds. That did happen. It was not as if, somebody going, traveling. These were located very conveniently near railway stations and steamers, ferry carts and all that. So clearly these offered cooked food, and that was definitely a temptation, especially when people were traveling for days and they could not always carry with them whatever chire muri and whatever they would typically eat while traveling, the typical upper caste food choices while on travel. So many of them did come to these places and they did eat. But the point that I was trying to, which definitely makes these a social leveler, one point that I mentioned right at the beginning, the eating arrangements, the sitting arrangements and all that make this a great social leveler. But this was all very expedient measures. This is not something that was happening on an everyday basis. This is not something that they were celebrating. This was something that happened, on the, surreptitiously, maybe once in a while, if there was no other choice left. meant. This was not something that they really consciously did, they went out of their way to do. Now, one comment here that I missed out from Professor Gupta, you talked about taste being something very difficult to pin down. Sometimes we are tempted and sometimes we eat, despite the fact that it's something forbidden. Clearly, this was happening in the Anglo-Indian eateries where people were eating quote unquote forbidden, the forbidden food. In the steamer services also, they were eating meat, and that was also where occasionally they may have they may have been tempted to eat, and they may have given way to that temptation. But as once again, the point that I was making is that these were all done occasionally, not something that they did regularly, and that definitely, so the argument that I am trying to make is definitely not, I would stick to that argument, in the light of this happening only on occasions. So that's one thing. And young students occasionally coming to Calcutta occasionally did cook themselves, or they hired a quick cook, paid together collectively, because it was not always possible for them to cook. And it was always economical to collectively hire a cook, and it was also convenient for them. That also happened. You can see that in Sharat Chandra. This is something. And there were very rich students also who came to Calcutta. They also traveled with their own cooks. In Pothed Dabi, you find Doku traveling with a Brahmin cook, Tiwari, and this also happened occasionally. And so far as East Bengal cuisine is concerned, we do hear a lot about East Bengal cuisine as well. Not that I'm aware of any book which deals with East Bengal cuisine in particular. Yes, there is one other question on area-centric, area study approach to cuisine. Is there only one style of cooking food in Bengal? Definitely not. Sylheti style would be very different, definitely from the West Bengal style. And ask any so-called Bengal, and they will say that there's too much sugar in in Koti cooking and not in Bengal cooking. So there's a difference definitely in the way food is cooked in the two regions. Even within East Bengal, you have much difference between Dhakai cuisine and Chittagong cuisine. Chittagong cuisine there's much use of chili, for instance. So these differences notwithstanding, there seems to be an agreement among people who say they come from Pug Bangla, the so-called the Bengal, that their style of cooking is significantly different from the Goti style of cooking, West Bengal style of cooking. So that definitely then, there is an agreement that there is much similarity there, which definitely allows us to go for an area-specific approach, if that answers your question. Then there is one which says the gender dimension. Yes, as I said, more work needs to be done definitely along these lines, but it is true that the many of these newly emerging, the emerging eating spaces, they also offer a role to women. So women were also able to come fund, as in the case of Adarsh Hindu Hotel, or maybe play some role or the other in management, not very visibly perhaps, but definitely. Otherwise, I would not have found that mention in one of the websites of one of the Pice hotels that the women of the family played a very important role. So clearly, then they were opening up new avenues for women as well. But my work does not deal with that aspect. And there's definitely much potential to carry any kind of work in that direction further. So I don't understand the Pice Hotel. Why Pice Hotel is because each item on the menu was chargeable, and there was a fee to be paid for each and every item, from which came the concept of Pice Hotel, if that answers your question. I think that's all for the moment. I don't know whether I've been able to offer.
So you've done a very, very brilliant job, Madhumita. So anybody else has any question, comments, please, if anyone else has any.
I just wanted to ask,
Yeah,
Yeah,
please go
so,
ahead.
ma'am, since Charu ma'am and everyone was talking about the gender and this, what you call the caste society and all. So, do we see any price demarcations? Like, do we have any price differences when you go hotel by hotel or so? So, do you see any kind of price demarcations and all?
Not much that I could spot. Most of these were charging, at least even now, I'm actually looking at the contents don't carry what price they charged back then. That kind of record will require, I think, one, in this project, if I, think of taking this forward after this, then I would definitely like to go and visit some of these pies hotels to talk to them to see if they do maintain old records or not. But at the moment, what I can see from their websites is that the prices are more or less similar. 100 rupees, 150 rupees for an entire meal. If you need to take extra non-vegetarian items, then you pay extra and all that. It is not very significantly high. Still pretty low. I have eaten in one or two of these spice hotels myself, but years back. So the price was still very low. And you got a wholesome meal, which included fish but not meat, two vegetables at least, dal and and then aloo bhaja and all that. So it was quite cheap back then. So.
Thank you.
One more question, by this Anirban Saha, who says that I just want to know the place of regional foods apart from Kolkata in the process of cosmopolitization of Bengali food. So, like besides Calcutta, were there other kind of places,
Place of regional foods apart from Kolkata in the process of cosmopolitization of Bengali food. Apart from Kolkata, you mean as in Bengal? Cosmopolitan food, I would say, because Kolkata would be the only place more or less. I can't think of, even now you do not really have, Kolkata seems to be the center in Bengal, and you do not have very many big cities in Bengal other than Kolkata. All the other places like Bardhaman or many other places, they've not really developed the way they should have developed. So it is, there is, if it is not there now, I mean, there's no doubt that even back then, those would not have emerged as, food hubs. I don't think so. It's unlikely, that is. So you do not have these places. Like, for instance, I live in Gujarat, and you have some of these places. Surat, there is, Baroda. You have, of course, Ahmedabad and all that. And each of these, if you go, they are quite big places. They have their airports. They have a lot of other things. And if you go there, you can see big commercial centers and all. Now, of course, you would find them in many other places in Bengal. But to the extent that they should have developed, urbanization in Bengal has not really dispersed the way it should have. So you don't really have very many of these places. Back then, it's unlikely that there would have existed more cosmopolitan food centers.
Thanks, Madhumita. I'll hand over back to the seminar committee for formal thanks and for the closing of this very interesting talk.
Thank you so much, Professor Gupta. Really appreciate your comments.
Please call me Charu.
Hope to meet you sometime soon.
Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am, for the very engaging talk. And since this was our last lecture of this webinar series, we would take this opportunity to thank Professor Raziuddin Akil and all other professors who have been there with us, who have helped us organize this series of webinars. So would you like to say something, sir? Akil, sir?
I would like to take this opportunity to thank Professor Akil, Razi, as I call him. A very big thank you to Razi. I mean, as I said, he commented on an earlier draft of the paper, and I acknowledge him in the paper itself. So big thank you for the invitation as well, Razi.
No, thank you very much. Your paper is very, very interesting. I really relish all the telebhajas and, the food on the platter. As I was saying that not only the Bengali cuisine, as we would like that to happen, has not happened entirely with all the different kinds of varieties, and also we need to bring in the Mughlai platter as also the Kolkata Chinese. So there is a variety for women also to go out in the evening. So they keep their sansar back home and then do all the eating outside. Not so much Bengali food, but other items. So thank you very much, and thank you to all the seminar committee members, students who have managed this so very well. Thanks a lot.
Let's give a hand to Professor Razi Akil for absolutely the fabulous kind of work that has been done, for this whole semester, amidst these very, very tough times. We've had so many seminars regularly, and that really needs to be.
Wonderful seminars. I've listened to some of them. Very good work, I must say. Real hearty congratulations. Thank the seminar committee as well for.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. And thanks to all those who attended our webinar series. So please stay tuned to our Facebook page and our history department website for any further updates. Thank you.
Okay, I'll log out in that case. Thank you.
I'll also log out.